There's a few things that'll make any sci-fi game better. Aliens, conspiracies, mad scientists, and of course, David Duchovny. Welcome, my name's AZ Ash and welcome to another PC game retrospective video. There are a few places in the world that hold more secrecy than the Air Force Test and Training Range located in Nevada, USA, also known as Area 51. The secrecy and cult status of the site has fueled countless books, movies, television series, and even video games. Now, many games have featured levels or chapters which center around Area 51, but there have been some specific games which put Area 51 as the main focus of the game. The best example of this is the Atari-launched and subsequently Midway published series, aptly named Area 51. The first title, released in 1995, was an arcade light gun shooter, which later saw ports to PlayStation, Saturn, and PC. And while the PC box rightly proclaims that the arcade was a #1 hit, the ports were not, with most reviews labelling them as average at best. The next outing for PC and consoles came 10 years later in 2005, with the release of the subject of this video, and for the most part, it released to a better but not by much reception, with the PC version holding a Metacritic of 67 and the console versions both holding a slightly higher rating. The final title, released just 2 years later in 2007, known as Area 51 Black Site, served as somewhat of a loosely connected sequel to the 2005 game. However, critical reception for the series eroded further, with the PC version holding a Metacritic rating of just 60. The version we're playing today is the 2005 PC version, although there are some changes which I've implemented to provide a better visual experience, namely widescreen. Now, I assumed this would be quite an easy process after I noticed a fan-made version of the game called Project Dreamland, which claims to fix a variety of issues in the game, re-implement the long-dead multiplayer, and importantly, offer a widescreen resolution. However, for reasons that I still cannot explain, I was never able to successfully install it on my Windows 11 machine, with it hanging during the installation process regardless of compatibility or privilege settings. In one way, I was disappointed that I wouldn't get to experience a slightly more modern version of the game, but on the other hand, at least I felt better equipped to pass judgment on the original state of the game. Now, I did end up finding a widescreen fix, which then actually broke performance. However, after applying a further fix with DG Voodoo, I was able to play the game in widescreen resolution without any performance issues. Oh, and I should mention that while the game and in-engine cutscenes are in the correct widescreen aspect ratio, the pre-encoded videos dotted throughout the game do appear stretched. It's not ideal, but honestly, the majority of cutscenes are in-engine, and this change never really pulled me out of the game world. Now here's a somewhat unusual fact. In 2008, the US Air Force sponsored the free release of 3 games: The Suffering, Rise and Fall, and Area 51. It's certainly one of the more unusual sponsorships I've seen, but I guess the idea was that the advertising would help encourage enlistment? I'm really not too sure, but either way, it was certainly a win for those wanting to play the game. Story-wise, the game sees the player take control of the David Duchovny-voiced protagonist, Ethan Cole, a member of the US military unit Hazmat Bravo. After receiving a distress call of sorts from the titular Area 51, Cole's team arrives on site to provide assistance, only to find that the threat they are responding to is much larger than they initially thought, and Cole is now not just fighting for his own survival, but that of the entire planet's. Honestly, for a relatively short game, clocking in at around 7 hours, it's a surprisingly deep story with quite a lot going on, complete with a satisfying conclusion. I have to admit that fairly early on, when the game was setting up its various plot threads, I did have concerns on how it would all be tied together and wrapped up, but to the game's credit, it accomplished it, and I'd certainly consider this as one of the better FPS storylines. If you like any of the themes explored in the X-Files, then I can pretty much guarantee this is a tale you are going to enjoy. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's dual wield some weapons, eliminate some mutants, and head back to 2005 to remember Area 51. Outside of the story, one of the things that kept me engaged in the game was the sheer variety of gameplay. Now, let me qualify this. Yes, the game largely takes place inside the Area 51 facility, and from an environmental perspective, there is not an enormous amount of variety. However, the developers have done a really good job to introduce other systems and mechanics to maintain player engagement. There are simple examples of this like squad mechanics, platforming, and puzzles, and then there are some more complex examples like the databank and mutant mode, both of which I'll get to shortly. Firstly, the basics. Overall control is good. It's nothing super impressive, and you are getting the old scale up and down a ladder with both of your hands holding a weapon, but what's here works for the majority of the situations the game throws at you. There are some platforming sections which I generally dislike in FPS games, but it's used fairly sparingly in Area 51, and in most cases fits into broader puzzles being posed to the player. Overall, you're not going to really need to think about control, apart from remapping the strangest decision I have ever seen in a 2000s era shooter, with the enter key being the default fire key as opposed to mouse left click. I'm really not sure what happened here, but a quick remap in the menu will allow you to continue with some normality. Combat's broken down into two types, the vanilla Ethan Cole combat and the mutated version of Ethan Cole that you can transform into. The standard combat is very solid and certainly stands up well against any other shooter of the time. During specific sections of the game, you will have squad mates which also contribute to the firefight, although they are more for show than anything else, with the player needing to do most of the heavy lifting combat-wise. There's generally a loop which will see you need to defeat all the enemies in an area before your squad mate will open the next door to proceed, and you'd think that this would get old pretty quickly, but the game does a good job of mixing up these type of encounters with other objective type encounters, such as needing to secure an item or device to progress. There's also some timed sections which require you to protect a squad mate while they hack into a computer terminal to open a locked door. And here's a really nice touch that I want to highlight. If the squad mate who is doing the hacking is attacked, they won't just die with a game over screen, they will stop what they are doing and defend themselves, with the countdown timer then beginning to count up, as opposed to down, for the duration they are away from the terminal. It helps sell the immersion of the game world because it represents what the player would consider a logical outcome. Gunplay is very strong. In fact, I'd go as far to say as it's some of the best of the time. There isn't a huge roster of weapons in the game, but what's here is used very well. In some first-person shooters, once you acquire a particular weapon, you can fall into the trap of never needing to change from that weapon for the entire adventure. This is definitely not the case in Area 51, in part due to the varied level geometry. Yes, it's all in a secret base, but there are tight corridors which are better suited to things like the shotgun, and then there are large open areas which demand the use of the assault rifle. Combine this with the occasional sniper you come up against, and you'll be switching to the sniper rifle also. Several of the weapons also allow you to dual wield them, and this is balanced really well. You can dual wield a weapon if you pick up another of that kind, but you can't reload until you have depleted both clips, and when you do, you drop the additional weapon. Like with a squad countdown mechanic, it helps with the immersion because it seems logical. The other type of combat is the mutant combat, which is achieved by filling a mutant meter, which can be refilled by either collecting mutated DNA from specific enemies or killing enemies while in mutated form. Once a meter is high enough, you can turn into a mutant and do greatly increased melee damage, as well as a few ranged attacks. Now, this sounds like it would be a lot of fun, only it isn't. Well, not as much as it should be. Firstly, your speed is increased. However, the handicap of not really having any viable ranged weapons means that in the traversal to get within melee range, you will often have to take a lot of damage. Now, the meter is pretty easy to fill, meaning that you can switch to this mode fairly often. However, I feel a better approach would have been to increase the movement speed further and ration out the ability to switch to the mode less often. As it's implemented though, there was never really a scenario I encountered, save for one boss battle, where it provided any type of real advantage or provided any type of feeling of power, which is what I suspect the developers were going for. Thankfully though, there are other mechanics in the game to keep the player engaged, such as the databank system. Early on in your adventure, you receive a scanner, which is used for various plot points, as well as scanning a variety of top secret documents hidden throughout the levels. Once you have scanned an item, you can view it in a dedicated menu. These documents, while serving as somewhat of an achievement list, Once collected, help fill in parts of the overarching story and history of the secretive site, something which, if you are like me and have a keen interest in the overall setting, are practically required to get the full story experience. The game's difficulty curve is just that, a curve as opposed to a spike. This is a good thing. Early on, ammo and health will be plentiful. However, as the game progresses, both ammo and health become less common, forcing the player to slow things down unless they want to meet an early demise. I wouldn't say that it's an extremely difficult game, but I would say that you need to have a strategy when approaching the large set pieces, as running in all guns blazing will often end badly. Overall, the systems and mechanics which support the main combat complement it well, and I don't have too much to say in the way of criticism. There are some what I call tropes of the time. For example, some of the scripted sequences continue to play out regardless of your own interaction. Like, I'm pretty sure I get shots on this mutant, but it doesn't even bat an eyelid. Outside of some of the more common challenges of the time though, the only other thing which really comes to mind is the sheer number of cutscenes, or more to the point, the frequency of the cutscenes. There's many sections in the game where you'll see a cutscene, move 100 meters forward, and then see another cutscene. While sometimes it definitely makes sense, I think that at times the developers could have let the environment do the talking as opposed to the player. However, this is certainly not a huge issue and likely something which won't even be noticed by the majority of players. The game's presentation has areas of strength and areas of weakness. The actual environment is quite well realised and does a really good job of portraying the location. While the game is largely confined to the one location, there is plenty to see and do in Area 51. Office areas, medical areas, science areas and more all form part of the environment you'll be navigating throughout your time with the game. Asset quality is also likewise good, and another small touch that's not required but appreciated: when you shoot particular gas canisters, they will spew out the gas they contain until it all slowly escapes. Again, something that you don't expect, but is there nevertheless. Menus are all very straightforward, and there's plenty of options to be found for those wishing to tweak any settings. Where the presentation does fall down a bit for me is in the enemy design and models, specifically the lack of variety. For a large stretch of the game, you will encounter the same 3 enemies for hours on end, and I do think there was a missed opportunity here for a little more variety. In my entire playthrough, I didn't encounter any crashes. However, I did manage to clip myself somehow in the entrance of an elevator, where I then got stuck and subsequently died. Certainly not game-breaking, but it is worth mentioning. Performance on a modern PC was fine, and that's probably the best way to sum up the presentation. Fine. There's nothing groundbreaking about the presentation, but nothing terribly wrong with it at the same time. Sound design is quite good. There's an appropriately sci-fi soundtrack for the majority of the game, and all of the effects sound pretty good too. Where the game does an excellent job sound-wise is with the voice acting. Led by David Duchovny's performance, all of the voice actors convey the gravity of the situation they find themselves in really well.
We've had to use force before. This was different. The drop location was different. Very different. Government conspiracies, secret weapon testing, aliens. I didn't believe any of it.
Like the overall presentation, it's not an audio masterpiece, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with it. Now, Area 51 is an interesting game. Normally in a game with an aggregate score below 70 on Metacritic, I can point to at least one system or mechanic which feels totally broken or completely out of place. But in the case of Area 51, I can't. Yes, there are some things which don't work as well as they could, but there's nothing really objectively broken here. Reading through some of the reviews from 2005, the main criticisms seem to revolve around the game being repetitive and lacking creativity, something which I don't agree with. Yes, the location could be considered repetitive to a degree, but the progression of the game's systems and mechanics throughout the journey means it never really becomes an issue. And as for the comments on the lack of creativity, I certainly don't agree with this. I think the game showcases some great creativity in between delivering a robust first-person shooting experience. While I don't make a point of assigning ratings to the games I review, in the case of Area 51, I can safely say that I think the current Metacritic of 67 is undervaluing the game, and that in my opinion, that number should at least be starting with a 7, possibly even an 8. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.